Everyone talks about communication. We praise it. We teach it. We build entire industries around it. From motivational speakers to social media influencers, the modern world worships the voice that never stops speaking. We are told that to survive, to connect, to succeed, we must always share, update, broadcast, and express. But what if that is only half the story? What if the very thing society glorifies, constant communication, is also the very thing that drains us of our deepest strength? What if true power doesn't come from endless chatter, but from its exact opposite? The Stoics knew something the modern world has forgotten. They discovered a secret about silence, a kind of silence that is not weakness, not emptiness, but raw power. The kind of silence that unsettles, that exposes, that terrifies. A silence so sharp that it forces others to reveal themselves while you remain untouchable. Think about it. The world is addicted to noise. Notifications buzzing, voices debating, politicians shouting, influencers begging for your attention. Everyone scrambling to be heard, terrified of being ignored. In this storm of endless words, silence becomes an act of rebellion. To withhold, to pause, to remain still, that is to create a void that others rush to fill. And in that void lies control. But society doesn't like control it cannot predict. That's why silence terrifies people. When you don't speak, they cannot measure you. When you don't reveal, they cannot categorize you. When you don't explain, they cannot control the story about you. Silence makes others nervous because it strips away their usual weapons. Without noise, without words, without constant explanation, they are left face to face with themselves. And most people cannot endure that confrontation. The Stoics mastered this. They understood that silence isn't the absence of communication. It's a higher form of it. Words are cheap, but silence costs you something. It demands self-control. It demands confidence. It demands that you resist the urge to defend, to justify, to please. And that resistance reveals a strength that no amount of eloquence could ever equal. Now imagine this in a society like ours. A world where your value is measured by visibility, where people believe that to exist, they must post. To matter, they must speak. To be remembered, they must constantly perform. What happens when someone refuses? What happens when someone walks into a room and doesn't need to prove themselves with noise? That person becomes an enigma, and nothing draws attention more powerfully than mystery. If this already strikes something in you, subscribe now and leave a comment. Let's see how many of us are ready to embrace the silence. Silence is not passive. It is not empty. It is pressure. It is weight. It is the pause before the storm, the stillness that makes the entire room shift in tension. Think of a courtroom where a lawyer asks a devastating question and then waits. That silence forces the witness to break, to stumble, to reveal. Think of a general before battle, standing quietly while his men look to him for strength. His silence says more than 1,000 speeches could. Think of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, who wrote to himself not in loud declarations, but in quiet reflections meant never to be published. His silence has echoed across 2,000 years, louder than the speeches of all his rivals. This is why silence terrifies society, because it cannot be bought. It cannot be manipulated. It cannot be performed for applause. It is a power that belongs only to those who are unafraid of themselves. And most of the world is afraid. Afraid of emptiness. Afraid of stillness. Afraid of being unseen, unheard, forgotten. That is why the average person drowns themselves in constant conversation, because without it, they might be forced to face the terrifying truth of who they really are. But the Stoics knew better. They knew that silence is not the end of communication, but the beginning of mastery. When you learn to hold your tongue, you learn to hold yourself. When you master silence, you master not only your words, but also your presence. You become the one who doesn't flinch when the room falls quiet. You become the one who can wait longer than anyone else. And that endurance breaks people in ways that arguments never could. Ask yourself, why do interrogators fear silence more than screaming? Because silence compels confession. Why do leaders pause before answering? Because silence multiplies the weight of their words. Why do the wise often say so little? Because silence preserves their energy, and when they do speak, their voice carries the force of thunder. Our society, however, despises silence. It rushes to fill every gap. In conversation, people panic if there is even a moment of quiet. On social media, silence is seen as irrelevance. In politics, silence is mistaken for weakness. And so we have trained ourselves to be terrified of it, to associate silence with absence, with failure, with being forgotten. But that is a lie. Silence is not absence, it is presence. Not weakness, but restraint. Not failure, but freedom. The freedom to not need applause, to not need approval, to not need constant validation. The freedom to simply exist, powerfully, without explanation. That is the Stoic secret. That is why silence, properly used, unsettles the noisy, intimidates the insecure, and terrifies a society that survives on endless distraction. It is the quietest revolution imaginable, to step out of the chaos of noise and stand unshaken in stillness. Now the question is no longer, why is silence so uncomfortable? The real question is, are you strong enough to wield it? Are you willing to stop feeding the endless machine of chatter? Are you willing to become the one who doesn't need to shout, because your silence already speaks louder than words ever could? Prepare yourself, because once you understand this, once you practice this, you'll never hear silence the same way again. The Stoics carried with them an uncomfortable truth, one that modern ears often reject, because it runs against everything our culture is built on. They believe that true strength comes not from what we project outward, but from what we guard within. In a world that has always loved noise, whether in the form of gossip in the marketplace or shouts in the political arena, the Stoics dared to whisper, or sometimes to not speak at all. They discovered that silence was not emptiness, but discipline. When Marcus Aurelius sat alone in his tent at night, writing private reflections that he never intended for the public eye, he was not indulging in isolation. He was practicing sovereignty over his own mind. Epictetus, born into slavery, understood that no man could chain his ability to remain inwardly calm. Seneca, surrounded by the decadence and corruption of Rome, wrote of the power that comes when a man governs his own inner life instead of being governed by the endless noise of others. For them, silence was not merely a lack of sound, it was a radical act of control. And here lies the discomfort. Silence strips away the external distractions and forces us to face ourselves, naked, without the armor of constant chatter. When the voice of the world fades, what remains is the raw voice within. Most people cannot bear to hear it. They fear what might surface in the stillness, doubts, regrets, hidden truths. But this is precisely why the Stoics embraced it. They knew that silence was a forge, a brutal teacher that left no room for illusions. By sitting in quiet, by resisting the urge to defend, explain, or escape, they strengthened their ability to master the one thing that mattered most themselves. This is where the ancient wisdom collides with our modern world. Today, validation is currency. To be seen, to be liked, to be followed, this is considered proof of worth. Our society conditions us to believe that if we are not constantly producing noise, we are invisible, irrelevant, forgotten. The Stoics stand in direct defiance of this illusion. Their lives remind us that relevance is not measured in noise, but in depth. That power is not found in performing for others, but in remaining unshaken when all performances stop. And so their truth remains as uncomfortable now as it was then. Silence is not a void, but but the clearest mirror we will ever face. This is why quiet breaks the mold. Imagine for a moment the paradox of our age. We live in a time where every person has been handed a platform, yet the more we speak, the less we are heard. Social media thrives on constant input, on the endless stream of updates, reactions, and declarations. It tricks us into believing that our worth is measured by the speed of our replies and the volume of our contributions. The system rewards noise, not wisdom. It thrives on immediacy, not depth. And so millions rush to speak before they think, to post before they reflect, to react before they truly understand. This is the trap. The fear of being unheard has grown so intense that silence itself feels like death to the modern ego. To not post is to not exist. To not comment is to not belong. To not react is to risk being forgotten. And so we drown ourselves in a sea of noise, not because we have something meaningful to say, but because we are terrified of what might happen if we stop. Yet here lies the paradox. The rare person who chooses silence instantly stands apart. The one who doesn't react right away, who doesn't reveal everything, who doesn't scramble to fill the void, suddenly gains a strange power. Their silence reframes the entire dynamic. It unsettles others, makes them question, wonder, project. By withholding, they create weight. This is why leaders often pause before speaking, why negotiators let the silence hang heavy at the table, why the wise man answers last if he answers at all. In a world addicted to noise, quiet becomes a weapon. It is a mirror held up to the restless, forcing them to see their own anxiety. Silence is not absence, it is presence so strong it does not need to prove itself. That is why it breaks the mold, why it terrifies those who rely on constant validation, and why it remains one of the most radical acts a person can practice in our age of endless chatter. Society, however, does not want us to embrace this. In fact, it is structured to prevent it. We live in an attention economy, a world where brands, platforms, and personalities compete not for our money directly, but for our focus, because they know that wherever attention flows, profit follows. Every second you spend in silence is a second not spent scrolling, not spent clicking, not spent consuming. Quietude, therefore, becomes a kind of rebellion, a luxury that the system wants to make nearly impossible. The rise of doom scrolling is not accidental, it is engineered. Algorithms are designed to keep you moving from one distraction to the next, never pausing long enough to notice the emptiness beneath it. And so silence becomes rare, and because it is rare, it becomes powerful. Yet in its absence, something else erodes, the ability to think deeply. Without moments of quiet, the mind cannot process experience. Without stillness, reflection decays. We grow accustomed to surface thoughts, to shallow takes, to reactive emotions. Critical thinking, patience, self-examination, all of these require silence, and all of these are quietly slipping away. That is the true cost of society's retreat from reflection. We are becoming a culture of noise without depth, stimulation without wisdom, voices without clarity. And when an entire society loses its capacity for silence, it loses its capacity for truth. Because truth does not scream, it waits in the stillness. The Stoics knew this. They sought solitude not as escape, but as medicine. They knew that silence was the space where thought ripens, where perspective sharpens, where the soul finds its balance. A society that has abandoned silence has abandoned its chance to truly know itself. And so the challenge before us is not small. To embrace silence is to swim against the current of an entire world built on distraction. But this is exactly why it matters. The power of silence lies not only in what it does to others, but in what it awakens within ourselves. Begin simply. Walk without your phone. Wake without reaching for a screen. End the day without drowning in noise. At first, it will feel unbearable. You will feel restless, exposed, even anxious. That is the discomfort the Stoics embraced. It is the sign that you are no longer numbing yourself with chatter, but facing the raw material of your own mind. Over time, this practice becomes transformative. In silence, you discover resilience because you no longer panic at the absence of stimulation. In silence, you discover clarity because the fog of endless noise begins to lift. In silence, you discover self-awareness because the voices of the world fall quiet enough for you to finally hear your own. This transformation does not make life easier, it makes it real. It makes you less dependent on external applause, less shaken by criticism, less vulnerable to manipulation. And this is what terrifies society the most. A person who cannot be swayed by noise is a person who cannot be controlled. That is why silence is unsettling, not just for those around you, but for the systems that profit from your distraction. So consider this a call, not to withdraw from the world, but to reclaim your place within it on your own terms. Step into the silence you have been taught to fear. Let it challenge you. Let it remake you. And let it terrify those who cannot understand how someone can stand so powerfully without saying a word. Arthur Schopenhauer once observed that most people fear silence, not because silence itself is dangerous, but because it strips away their illusions. He understood what few dare to admit. The majority of mankind cannot endure being alone with their own thoughts. To them, solitude feels like punishment. Quiet feels like emptiness. They mistake the absence of noise for the absence of life. And so they seek refuge in endless distraction, in conversation, in entertainment, in the ceaseless hum of the crowd. For Schopenhauer, this was not surprising. He believed that the average man is driven by what he called the will, a blind, restless force, forever hungry, forever unsatisfied. The will craves stimulation, movement, noise, and novelty, because without it, it feels its own weight. In silence, the will is revealed for what it is, a tormentor that never rests. That is why so many people cannot sit quietly in a room alone. It is not silence they fear, but the confrontation with the endless dissatisfaction that gnaws at them from within. But Schopenhauer also knew that silence is where the higher mind begins. He argued that genuine thinkers, philosophers, and creators are the few who do not merely endure solitude, but depend on it. For them, silence is not a void, but a canvas. It is the condition in which thought becomes sharp, where ideas take shape, where the intellect breaks free from the blind demands of the will. A man can be himself only so long as he is alone, he once wrote. And in this one sentence lies a truth that unsettles society. Because if silence reveals the self, then constant noise is nothing but escape. Consider how this plays out in the world today. The modern individual is never truly alone. The moment silence threatens to arrive, it is drowned in a flood of sound. Earbuds in, screens glowing, feeds refreshing. The machinery of distraction ensures that no one has to face the terrifying question Schopenhauer believed was at the root of human suffering. Who am I? When I am not consuming, not speaking, not escaping? The majority avoid this confrontation at all costs, but a rare few embrace it. And these few, the ones who can stand still in silence, are the ones who rise above the rest. Schopenhauer despised noise because he saw it as the enemy of depth. He famously called unnecessary noise the most impertinent of all interruptions. He loathed the hammering of builders, the barking of dogs, the careless chatter of men, not simply out of irritation, but because he believed noise symbolized the shallowness of society. It represented the triumph of distraction over contemplation. For him, silence was sacred. It was the soil in which the highest forms of human thought could grow. Without it, we remain trapped in superficiality. With it, we touch something eternal. This explains why silence terrifies society. Because silence makes thinkers visible, In noise, everyone is equal. All voices blur into one meaningless roar. But in silence, the difference emerges between those who have an inner world and those who do not. The empty soul cannot endure silence. The rich soul thrives in it. This distinction exposes the uncomfortable truth that most people live outwardly, borrowing their worth from others, while the few live inwardly, carrying their wealth within. To embrace silence, then, is to step into a realm where external validation loses its grip, where the herd can no longer define you. Schopenhauer would argue that society fears this because it undermines its foundation. The world thrives on conformity, on the constant exchange of noise that keeps individuals bound to the collective. Silence breaks that chain. It separates the thinker from the crowd, the self-possessed from the dependent, the free mind from the enslaved will. That is why society discourages silence, why it floods us with noise, why it convinces us that being unseen or unheard is failure. Because if too many people embraced silence, the machinery of distraction and consumption would collapse. But Schopenhauer also offered a vision of what happens when we do embrace it. In silence, he said, the mind is liberated from the endless tyranny of desire. We glimpse, if only for a moment, freedom from the will. We experience clarity, insight, even peace. The thinker uses this space to create, to reflect, to reach truths that noise will always bury. Silence, then, is not just terrifying, it is transcendent. It is the gate through which ordinary life ends and true individuality begins. Look at the great works of history. None of them were born from chatter. None of them emerged from endless noise. They were conceived in solitude, in quiet rooms, in silent walks, in the inward gaze of the thinker. Schopenhauer would remind us that every masterpiece is a child of silence, and that to fear silence is to fear the very conditions that make greatness possible. The question, then, is not whether silence is valuable. The question is whether we are brave enough to face it. Most will not. Most will retreat into distraction, filling every gap with sound, every pause with chatter, every silence with noise. But the few who choose differently will find what Schopenhauer himself found, that silence, though unsettling, is the only environment where the self becomes real. It is the proof that you do not need the crowd to exist. It is the space where you are no longer a slave to the will, but a master of yourself. And perhaps that is why silence terrifies society most of all. Because once you discover its power, you no longer need society in the same way. You can walk among the noise, untouched by it. You can live in a world that never stops speaking, and yet carry within you a strength that no amount of chatter can ever reach. And so, we return to the silence itself, not as emptiness, not as weakness, but as the invisible current that has always shaped the strongest souls. The Stoics were not worshippers of words. They were guardians of stillness. And in a world that never stops talking, stillness is no longer ordinary. It is extraordinary. If you've walked with me this far, it means part of you already feels the weight of this truth. Perhaps you have noticed how often we try to fill the gaps, how afraid we are of pauses, how desperate we are. But imagine what happens when you no longer fear that quiet. Imagine what happens when you step into it willingly. That is when you begin to lead yourself. That is when others begin to notice your strength without you ever needing to declare it. This is the secret the Stoics left behind, a secret hidden in plain sight. To embrace silence is to embrace power that no crowd can give and no critic can take away. It is not a path for the faint-hearted, but for those who are ready to stand apart in a world of noise. Not if this message struck something in you, carry it with you. And if you want to keep exploring these hidden truths, stay connected. Subscribe for more, share your thoughts in the comments, and let this conversation go beyond words. Because even here, in this space, silence will always speak the loudest dot. Until next time, remain still, remain strong, and let your silence terrify the noise.